my name is Anoushka Lucas and I'm playing Elizabeth Proctor in the Crucible. Yeah, okay, so the Crucible is a very famous sort of canonical American text written by Arthur Miller in the 50s, and it is about the Salem witch trials, which I think everyone is sort of vaguely aware of. But essentially, Arthur Miller at the time, it was the era of McCarthyism in the US in the 50s, and so there was this sort of witch hunt to try and find communists who were deemed to be the greatest enemy of the American Republic. And Arthur Miller was sort of embroiled in that. A lot of artists that he knew were being sort of investigated by the government, and he couldn't write about it explicitly, and so he tried to find a vehicle. It was like, how can we talk about this without talking about McCarthyism? And he landed on the Salem witch trials, which was in the 17th century, when a bunch of Puritans in Salem, upstate of New York, suddenly became convinced that all of the teenage girls were correct in identifying a society full of witches, and then they hanged like loads and loads of women for being witches, and some men for being wizards. And it's about sort of hysteria, mob mentality, and fear, and it also ends up being about religion. Elizabeth Proctor is John Proctor's wife, and John Proctor and Elizabeth are members of the Salem community, but they live slightly out of it, and they have slightly different views compared to the sort of like dogmatic Puritanism in the village. And it just so happens that the girl at the centre of the witch trials, who is accusing all of the witches, happens to be the 16-year-old maid that John Proctor had an affair with, and then Elizabeth Proctor found out about it and kicked her out. And then it just so happens that 7 months later, she accuses Elizabeth of being a witch.
What a crazy coincidence.
It's a crazy coincidence.
Like, there's no link there at all.
Yeah, no. Oh God, that's such a good question. I think one of the central things in the Crucible is essentially groupthink and the fear of stepping out of line with what authority is saying is the truth. I think that we see that in like a million different ways in our society at the moment. There's definitely, whether you're on the left or on the right, there are views that are held by the majority that in order to belong to that group, you often have to go along with, even if you are in dissent with those. I think, without going into anything too heavy at the moment, we're definitely in a position at the moment, I think, in this country where the government is acting in a particular way or voting in a particular way that isn't in alignment with the majority of the population, and the question of who gets to make those large decisions is very prescient at the moment. That's what makes great art, right? Is that it's the same with Shakespeare or Homer. And it's the reason that I think we can still justify putting on old texts and old plays, is that often they get to truths, human truths and social truths that don't really change that much over the thousands of years. I don't think human beings have evolved a huge amount since the dawn of civilization. All we've got now is like Instagram or multimedia in order to disseminate these messages further. So these things go further. And you look at Abigail Williams at the centre of the play, who sort of whips up this storm around her and drags all of the girls around her into this storm. You know, that's the equivalent of like a sort of very powerful social media influencer. Or we look at the gurus that we lift up. I don't want to compare Abigail Williams to Andrew Tate, because I think that she has really gone through it and been deeply wronged and is very vulnerable. But I think that she speaks to a sort of freedom and another way of being that appeals to all the other young people around her. I think that we have a tendency, and I think this is just a human tendency, to believe that we've progressed to such a point that the abhorrent views that we held 50 years ago or 100 years ago or 500 years ago are no longer present in our lives today or in the way that we lead our lives today. And what I've found I did Henry V into Oklahoma, and now I'm doing the Crucible, which are all texts that were written in different eras by men, and I'm playing women written by men. And what I've found in doing all of those, that these female parts are hugely accessible to me. I was talking about A Doll's House the other day in Ibsen, and I think it doesn't take very much to scrape at the society that we live in now and realize that most women are still living their lives in a culture that exists through the lens of the patriarchy. It just presents in certain different ways. I think it's really easy to believe that because we're like working towards pay equity and, is that the term, pay parity, and because feminism is something that we discuss a lot, great strides have been made. And not even just feminism, I think sort of, we're talking about anti-racist work, when we're talking about queer politics, there's a lot of very loud discussion, and sometimes it's easy, if you exist in a bubble on the internet, to believe that society is radically different to what it was 75 years ago. It's not. Elizabeth Proctor makes a lot of her decisions based on the fact that she has chosen somebody to marry and is now married to them, and upholding that institution is of huge importance to her. But also there's the complexity of like the economic codependence and the fact that she's reliant on this man to bring in the income and to look after the household and to raise her 4 children and to be socially acceptable. And I would argue that a lot of those principles are still at play today.
Right.
And they're not necessarily bad. They're not, but they're complicated. I think we lie to ourselves about the level of freedom that we have as individuals when actually we're all operating inside systems. And navigating those systems. And so when you play a historical character, the shape of the system might look a bit different, but the reality of being a person operating inside systems is always the same. I've been thinking a lot about, in sort of trying to find my own Elizabeth Proctor, when you take on a role that is famous, and also when you take on a part that many other extraordinary actors have played, you want to find a way to feel like you're not just a poor man's Sophie Okonedo. So, I'm always interested in how my characters relate to me, and I often find myself playing women trapped in a system that they don't want to partake in but have to. And I'm learning a lot through playing Elizabeth Proctor. She is hugely committed to what she has committed to, which I find weirdly relatable in terms of my career. But she operates from a place of principle most of the time. And I've been thinking about Navalny and the Russian dissident who has just died, and his wife, and the complexity of taking on a political cause, sometimes at the expense of your life or your private life, particularly. I think Elizabeth Proctor is absolutely fascinating. But what I also think is that she's very proud, and not necessarily always in a positive way. And her journey, as far as I can see, is we find her in the fallout from this affair, trying to no longer be raging at her husband, but still raging at her husband, and now his ex-girlfriend has gone off and started a witch hunt against her. It's not ideal. I think across the play she takes accountability for her part in what's happened in her marriage, and there is and she comes up against this system, and ultimately they sort of fail against the system. And so the question of what she can hold on to and what she can't, and how far her principles stretch, but also how much she looks at what she's responsible for. And I think she's a lot less proud by the end of the play. And that's a very useful character exercise for me. I think I can sometimes cling to pride unnecessarily. So it's good to play characters who are humbled. She's amazing. I'm really obsessed with her. I don't want to throw an entire genre under the bus.
Yeah.
I love musicals. I grew up watching musicals, wanting to be Nancy and wanting to be Eliza Doolittle. I think that it is true that in commercial musical theatre, there are some pretty basic brush stroke female characters, but I think that's also true in commercial theatre. What I think is probably true is that in this country, we are far better at straight theatre than we are at musical theatre when it comes to investigating it and making art. The joy of Oklahoma was that we were allowed to reimagine this text in a new form, which meant that modern people were allowed to make modern versions of these characters. And I think we have a problem with how we fund and develop new musical theatre. So there are not as many good, interesting new musicals coming through. That's what I think. Selfishly, as an actor, I crave complexity in every part of my life, and I find it more in straight theatre than in musical theatre at the moment. And ultimately, I would say the actor's job is to find the person in the part. So I've definitely had a run of parts that could be done in a very narrow way, and I've been lucky enough to work with directors who've been like, how far can you stretch this into a real woman? But it would be really joyful if there were more parts for women that did not circle around men. I do other things in my life. I'm a sister and a daughter and a friend and a writer and a performer, and often on stage you find yourself, even in this production, we're trying to really render the whole of Elizabeth. Elizabeth is a wife, she's also a mother, she's also a person, she's also somebody who thinks about theology, she's also like a daughter of immigrant settlers. Like, these people are lots of things.
Yeah.
Learn more. I think when I came into this industry, I was very green, as everybody is at the beginning, and I was incredibly lucky to find myself in rooms and with people who knew more than I did about how the industry worked. And even though I was convinced at the age of 22 that I was a genius, in retrospect, I didn't really know very much at all. And I didn't understand the way the business works. I didn't understand the structure of making theatre. I didn't know how to act, and I knew that I was good at something, and I didn't really know what to do with the thing that I was good at. And so I would say, go and watch and read and listen to things that you think are extraordinary, and also things that you think are bad, and things in the middle, and find people who are on the same wavelength to you and just make stuff with them. And also be patient. It takes a long time sometimes. It took me a long time, and will probably take more time, to figure out who I am as a person and who I am as an artist, and then to start making the art that I wanted to make. And it's okay if that takes 15 or 20 or even 30 or 40 years. It's not a rush. Our culture has a really bad habit of making people feel as though they've got a deadline that is not a real deadline. And the fact of the matter is, like, people will come into their own artistically at different moments. Also, you come into your own for a bit and then you lose it and then you find it again. But like, it's a long marathon. It's not a sprint. So at the beginning, if there's something that you don't know but you think you might want to know about, go and learn about it. Oh, please come and see our Crucible. I think it's quite good. We just did a run through this morning and it was very compelling, and I can say that because I'm only in half the play. This is a Crucible that's a bit different to Crucibles you might have seen before. We're all speaking in our own voices. Anthony said this wonderful thing before, which is that because it's set in a Puritan society and it's been done in a certain way before, sometimes it can be hard to keep track of all the different characters, but this is 16 people, 16 full human people, 16 stories to follow. And I think in our production, you do follow 16 people react in different ways and come up in different ways against the systems that they are stuck inside and railing against. And also, I think there are some exciting performances. And if you like milk, you will really like our show. Any kind of milk.
I want no more context, so everyone comes.
Yeah.
Just to figure out what
Thank
you're
you very
talking
much.
about.